Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so excited to be here today with Cheri Torres and Jackie Stavros for our webinar on their new book, the new edition of their book, Conversations Worth Having. So as you're coming in today, I hope you'll take a moment to get acquainted with the Zoom technology that we're using for today's event. So a few notes for you. One note is that we are recording today's event. It will be live later on our YouTube channel, and we'll send out a link to you. So in the event that you want to rewatch it for additional learning, or in the event that you want to share it with your colleagues or your friends or your family, everyone can benefit from this message, and we would encourage you to share it widely. So as you're coming in, I hope you'll also take a look at the chat, and we would love for you to say hello and let us know where you're calling in from. I am calling in from my dining room in Lambertville, Michigan. Jackie, where are you calling in from today?
I'm at Lawrence Technological University in Southfield, Michigan.
And Cheri, where are you today?
I am in Asheville, North Carolina, which is in the Smoky Mountain, Blue Ridge Mountain area.
I heard that you were getting some snow last week in that part of North Carolina. Is that true?
Up in the high elevations, there was snow. Yes.
Wow, it seems way too early for that. So I'm
Yes.
noticing that we have people calling in from everywhere. Hi to Grace in Toronto, to Chris in Pittsburgh, to Marion in New Jersey. We've got another Michigander on the call in Novi, Michigan. Someone working at a remote job in Indianapolis. So hi in Orange, California, and Texas, and Colorado Springs, and Anchorage, Dover, New Hampshire. We've got Billy from Syracuse University, and we have Kia in New Zealand. I wonder what time of day it is in New Zealand.
Wow.
Welcome in the UK and Florida and Des Moines. We have a caller from India, from Mexico, from Canada. Wow. South Africa, another from Canada. Amazing. We're so glad that all of you have joined us today. If you happen to be calling in from your workplace, I have noticed a few people mentioning their workplaces. Quite often people will attend these events as part of their personal and professional development. And I'd love to say I could shout out your organization. Wow, I'm loving all these international callers. We also have Spain represented on the call, another New Zealand. So amazing, amazing. So happy that you're choosing to invest your time with us today learning. Houston Community College in Texas is represented. So this is really, really wonderful to see. And welcome also to our friends at Barrett Kohler Publishers who have sponsored today's event. They are also the publishers of this book, Conversations Worth Having, now in its second edition. So thanks again for joining and for saying hello. We would welcome you to use the chat throughout today's event to type any questions or comments to get to know each other. And toward the end of the call, we will be taking some of your questions that have come in. So please feel free to use that chat throughout today's event. So before we get too far, I do want to take a moment to introduce our presenters today. And, I've had the privilege of knowing and partnering with Jackie and Cheri over many years, and their work has made a huge difference for our team as well as for those who have bought and read the book. And one of the most exciting things to me as we get started is to let you know that this is not only a book. So toward the end of the hour, we'll be telling you about some other opportunities to dive into this content through these Monday Kickstarts. Is that right, Cheri?
Monday Kickstarters.
Monday Kickstarters. There's also some workshops and some other opportunities to really dig deeper and implement this content in your organization or in your life. And so I look forward to that. Toward the end of the call, we'll tell you more, but a sneak preview that this is not just a book. Jackie and Cheri have really built an amazing library of resources around the content that is in the book. So quickly, Cheri Torres is the CEO of Collaborative by Design, and she partners with people to catalyze positive change in workplaces and communities. Jackie, as she mentioned, represents Lawrence Technical University, and her passion is also working with others to discover their purpose in creating positive change. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. And thank you to Barrett Kohler.
Amazing. So as we dive in today, we want to focus your energy and attention on this topic of conversation. And we do have a couple of polls that we'd like to get your feedback on. So first, we are curious about your relationship to conversations on difficult topics. And we're wondering, do you struggle to have good conversations about difficult topics? always, sometimes, rarely, or never. And if you have any comments that you want to add in the chat, we would love to hear. Interesting results. I don't know if you have any predictions, Jackie or Cheri. We don't want to sway the responses. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll in just a few moments, although people are still answering. So I think if I am honest, I almost always struggle when I have to have a conversation about a difficult topic. All right, let's take a look at these results. It looks like 75% of you say you sometimes struggle, 14% of you say you always struggle, and only 12% of you rarely struggle. There's not a person on today's event who answered the poll who never struggles having a conversation about a difficult topic. Let's take a look at the second poll, and we are curious about how much time in your life you spend in conversations. So what percentage of your waking moments do you spend in conversations with yourself and others, including on social media, emails, and in person? And we'll give you a few moments.
And that in yourself is the conversations you also have in your head.
You talk to yourself.
Yes, there's always that conversation going on in the background, isn't there?
Yeah.
All right, I'll give a few more moments because people are still answering this question. We gave some interesting answers. I don't know if you remember, Jackie and Cheri, and I don't know if you can see the poll as panelists, but we included this option of 100% and above.
Yeah, and that does include your monologue, Melody. Consider your monologue as part of this.
Oh, yes. I see that in the chat. People are looking for less than 50%. And I apologize, we might have missed that. So if you think that you use less than 50%, please tell us that in the chat. And just a quick reminder as you're chatting to please use the drop-down menu to select everyone so that everyone can see your comments and not just the hosts and panelists. All right, let's take a look at these results as well. It looks like this is pretty widely distributed, a lot of different responses. Is this what you would have expected to see, Jackie and Cheri?
Well, in our trainings, we usually get anywhere from 95% or higher.
Yeah, and it's usually because of those internal dialogues, the internal conversation that's constantly running. I really would love to meet with and talk with those people who have less than 50% of their day in conversation, because I want to know how they're stopping that internal chatter.
Yes, that's true. That would be a major feat. Well, let's dive in. You know, I'm so excited to learn from and with you again. And, you know, one of the things that we've talked about, and it also is on the back of the book, you say that a good conversation can make your day and a bad conversation can ruin your day. And so let's just start with some real basic conversation about what makes a good conversation.
So a good conversation is one that is both inquiry based and outcomes focused. So the people in that conversation are focused on where they want to go, where they want to move, what they want as a result of the conversation. And instead of just being comments back and forth, it's driven by questions that help to widen the view of what's possible and where they might be able to go in those conversations. And we can usually tell, most of us can assess internally whether a conversation is a good conversation or a bad conversation. And we just invite you to, the next time you're in a really good conversation, just check in with yourself and ask yourself, what's going on in this conversation that's making it so good?
Do you have anything to add, Jackie?
Yeah, I'm just going to add to what Cheri says, that tone and direction are really important. The tone is appreciative, the direction is positive, so you can almost feel yourself leaning into that conversation. So besides the inquiry, it's going to have an appreciative tone to it that values the people in the situation that you're having a conversation, even if it's a difficult one.
Got it. So tone and direction. That's helpful. So in the book, you share two practices in order to create what you call conversations worth having. So could we talk about those two, and also maybe some examples and stories?
Yeah, I'll give it a start. So the two practices are asking questions, and we call it generative questions. And these are questions that open you up. They surface assumptions. They make the invisible visible. They bring new possibilities into the conversations. So a generative question, when you think of self-talk, could be, what am I making up? What's going on here? A generative question could ask for your perspective. What do you think? Probably my favorite generative question is, what are your wishes? What would you like to see happen? And the second practice is what we call positive framing. And positive framing, I just want to point out that you're going to start with problems and issues and challenges in your organizations, but positive framing is coming at the challenge or the issue from a different perspective and beginning to, you name the problem, you talk about, is this really the problem we need to be discussing? Then you move it into we call it the flip. You name it, flip it to the positive opposite, but you got to keep going and talk about what is it that if the positive opposite was true, you'd really want to see happen.
Well, I'd love to dive into some examples of that.
So an example might be, for instance, if somebody in your office or even your teenager is complaining a lot about something, instead of getting into an argument about it or justifying why something is the way it is, to simply ask questions such as, what would you like to see instead of this? What outcome are you hoping for? How is this impacting your work, or how is this impacting you in our house? And how might we come to some sort of a compromise? That's a really simple example.
Yeah, I love that. So thinking about questions to get at the positive frame of the issue.
Yes, yeah.
Jackie, did you want to add anything there? Yeah, the only other thing I would add, being a professor, students, this is the time of year where they talk about bad grades or bad performance, and then we help them flip it. Well, what's the positive opposite? And they look at us, well, we want really good grades. And then we say, well, what is it like? What do we want to talk about if you have really good grades? And then they become very creative in saying, well, we have better time management. We're getting better rest. So we start talking about creating that environment where an outcome is going to be better grades, but it's more than just the good grades for them.
That's a really great example, and very timely as we get closer to final season for many of our students. So, I'm going to push back a little bit, because you're making it sound like this is really easy. And, especially, we referenced at the beginning these difficult conversations. And I hear you saying, well, look at the flip, whatever. So, how can this be so effective? And is there really any evidence to back up that these two practices are going to make a difference in our organizations and in our lives?
It's a great question, Becky. And it is that simple, but it is not easy to change. And the reason for that is, from a neurological perspective, we're really wired to scan for what danger. We're wired to scan for what's wrong in order to stay alive. And so that's a primary driver in our brain. And what the practices are doing is suggesting that we shift that and not focus on, unless of course there's a real reason to focus on the danger. But there aren't very many saber-toothed tigers anymore. And our brain, our ego, turns everything into a saber-toothed tiger. What the research shows is that when we're operating from that place of defensiveness or high stress, we actually have limited or inhibited capacity to think critically, to access the prefrontal lobe, which is where our emotional intelligence is, where we can connect with other people and tap into our creativity. And so when we are in those more fear-based mindsets, we actually can't access our potential. And when we have conversations that put people in that kind of a mindset, we don't allow them to connect with us in the fullest way possible. And so one of the things that we've discovered that in trying to figure out how do we go from simple but not easy to simple but a little bit easier is how do we intentionally calm that overreactive nervous system so that we can actually communicate from our full brain, from the prefrontal lobe, where we can connect and have a conversation worth having. And that was one of the primary drivers of this new edition, was our new chapter.
So that leads me to an important question, because I know in the new edition, that new chapter is really focused on this idea of tuning in. And, you know, that the tuning in is tied to the brain science that you're referencing, Cheri. So can we talk a little bit about tuning in and how it relates to this more positive communication that we want to have with others?
Yeah, let me just start with saying tuning in is really like deep listening. And just imagine a straight line. And if you're sitting somewhere, if you drew a straight line, and you know, if you're above the line, you're in that appreciative space where you're valuing the person. It's easier to get into these two practices. But if we're below the line, you're usually in a depreciative place. And the technique that we talk about in this chapter is in the chapter is called Who's Driving? Tune in. And so when you tune in, we ask you, and as I say these words, just kind of join me here. Take a moment and just pause. That just kind of stops that momentum, especially if the momentum's pulling you down. So just pause, breathe, just take a deep breath if you're sitting here with me. And that breathing just resets what Cheri talked about, the body mindset and the brain. And then you get curious, and curiosity is a really good place to be in. And if you find yourself below that line, you begin to ask questions after you pause, breathe, and get curious. You can say, you know, what is this conversation really about? What assumptions am I making? Why have I fallen below the line? And sometimes you fall below the line because it's daylight savings time this week and you haven't gotten enough sleep, or you haven't had enough water to drink, or you're dehydrated. So a lot of things can push you below the line, and you need to get above the line to that appreciative space and tune in.
So I love the visual of the line, and the way that we shift from being below the line to getting above the line is to pause and breathe.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think the getting curious is also a positive emotion. And again, you had mentioned research before, but the research into positive psychology shows that positive emotions also bring you into the prefrontal cortex and give you greater access. They broaden your ability to think and engage with others.
Yeah, Becky, I want to show this one technique. Tony Benner, one of our trainers, showed this to us a couple of years ago. And if you just take your hands with me for a minute, and when you're coming from that protect mode, everybody, put your hands behind your head, everybody. Where are your thumbs? They're pointed down. That's when you're in that protect mode. And then let's bring our hands to the front. Cheri talked about being in the prefrontal mode. Where are your thumbs? So just kind of think and look at, and Becky, you're smiling. Just that simple exercise shows you the direction you're at.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting.
And Chris typed in, find this above and below the model in the conscious leadership. And absolutely look at the conscious leadership. There's a 3-minute video that we mentioned it in our book, but we show that video clip all the time.
Yeah, this is just so powerful. I want to keep doing it. So I'm wondering about those people who might be listening who aren't naturally curious. And is there a way that we can enhance our own skill of being curious? I know I'm throwing this in. This is just my question in the moment.
Yeah. The other day, I got to talk about this book to football players, and I Googled curiosity and how healthy curiosity is. And curiosity of asking questions that you really want to know. So tell me how you did that, or why did you think that way, or how did this happen? And it's not a simple I don't know or yes, but it's really, you are curious, you genuinely care and want to know more about the situation or the person.
The other thing I think is, I think internally, we all, as children, we were all curious. And one way to kind of, I think, trigger your own curiosity is to ask yourself generative questions. And a generative questions really, it widens the screen so that it lets in more information for you. Questions like, what might I be missing? Or what might I be missing? What might I not know that could be important? What assumptions am I making? How is my worldview or my belief system influencing what's right in front of me? What does that person know that I don't know? What's the different perspective? And I think when you come from a place of, I only know myself, I don't know other people, it has a tendency to, I think, expand your curiosity about others, or expand your curiosity about situations. Yeah, we offer a technique called the do-over, which I also think would inspire people to get more curious. And in a do-over, you take a conversation that was not a great conversation that you wish you could do over, and recall that situation, and then identify what were the facts, just the facts, and what did I make up, or how did I fill in parts of the story? And then ask yourself, what else might have been going on? What other story would explain those facts? And if you do that often enough, your nervous system starts to question its assumption that it's right all the time. And so I think it drives a sense of curiosity.
Yeah, and Kevin typed in, helpful to always see others as a mystery. And many years ago, when you compared appreciative inquiry and then there's problem solving, I remember David Cooperrider showing a slide that says you can look at organizations as problems to be solved or organizations as a mystery and people as a mystery. So Kevin, thank you for kind of zoning in on that thought, to see others as a mystery as they are.
Instead of thinking that we have everyone figured out.
Right.
So there's some really interesting chat happening, and I'm so thrilled to see that. I always love it when people are engaged with the content, and we will get to some of the questions in the chat toward the end of the hour. But one of the things that we want to talk about now is, why you decided to do a second edition right now. There's so many things that are happening in our world, and some of the comments in the chat are asking about that, with so many polarizing issues dividing us. So talk to us about, why this edition was so important to you this year.
I think for two reasons. The first one was we realized that our conversations come from whatever body mindset we're in. So if we are attached to our emotions, if we are attached to being right, whatever is driving our body mindset, if we don't become conscious of that, that's going to spill over into our conversations. And so that the chapter on tuning in, we really wanted that, because that, in our trainings with people, that has been, for many people, one of the key factors in their being able to use the two practices. The second one was that we have been realizing how essential generative questions are to everything. They're even essential to creating a positive frame. And in the first edition, we kind of gave equal leverage, equal weight to both of those concepts. And I think what we've learned is generative questions are incredibly powerful because they allow us to widen our view, to help us take in more of what's actually going on in the world than the narrow view we might be looking from. And so when we ask those questions, we change the way we think, and we change the way other people think. And we really need new ways of thinking in the world right now. And if we can stay with asking each other generative questions that are not coming from a place of judgment and a fixed mindset, but instead from a place of growth mindset and curiosity, and a real sense of, let's make the invisible visible, and let's find ways to create shared understanding. And then let's ask questions about how we might actually be able to create future communities that will work around climate change and work around helping all people thrive.
And I would just add to what Cheri's saying is our editor, Steve Parasante from Barrett Kohler, really pushed us to like, what's that theory of change, or what's that theory that's going to help these practices to be really, really successful. And from our readers, we were able to put in some new stories. We have a list of questions at the end of the book now, and more questions and scenarios across the spectrum of organizations, government, just having conversations with your family and your communities.
Fantastic. So for a moment, I want to talk about the concept of appreciative inquiry, because you've mentioned appreciative and you referenced David Cooper-Ryder. So in a broad sense, how can appreciative inquiry help us communicate more effectively?
So if you're not familiar with appreciative inquiry, the appreciative inquiry is known as one of the most effective tools to create positive change, and people are familiar with something called a 5D cycle. We really zoned in on this book that appreciative inquiry, and Cheri talked about it at the beginning today. It's the power of using inquiry, engaging in questions, not just statement based, and appreciation is value. And David Cooper-Ryder and Ron Fry and the doctorate students at Case Western Reserve came up with this concept. It was a qualitative research technique back in the 80s. And it went from a qualitative research way of asking questions to a methodology. You can actually organize conversations with 5 people or 5,000 people. So appreciative inquiry is kind of like the operating system, one of the main areas that gave us, we've been doing this since 1995, that really gave us the energy to say, how do you bring appreciative inquiry into everyday living?
So I do have a question in the chat about giving some more information about that 5D cycle. Jackie, I don't know if you or Cheri can share what that 5D cycle is.
Yeah, so the 5D cycle is where we define a topic that we want to have a conversation around. So you define the topic, and that's, remember, the framing of it. And then you have a discovery into the topic. So let's say the topic was, how do we build a high performing team? And then you would ask generative questions about what is your experience of a high performing team, or what is your peak experience, or where have you seen this before? And you could ask a question in the dream stage, which is the 3rd D, is what would it look like if we had a high performing team in this organization? What would that dream be? Where would we be 2 to 3 years from now? And then it gets very, I like to say, action oriented, that you would design that high performing team. What is going to get us there? How do we have to change as a team here? And then the last D is called destiny, which is really where you deliver on what you designed and what you dreamed and what you discovered. And so it's a very iterative cycle of defining what we want to talk about, discovering it more, dreaming what would this look like, designing it, and then delivering it.
Thank you for clarifying that. And hopefully, Chip, that was helpful to you. So I know that this book is not only about better conversations in the workplace. Can we talk for a few minutes about how we could use those practices in our personal lives as well?
Sure. In fact, most people that we work with, even when we're working with corporate clients, the first place they try this is at home, with their kids, with their partners. And the practices, they really work they work anywhere. And once you start to ask questions instead of make statements, especially with loved ones, you find it shifts the relationship almost immediately. I can give you just a quick example of myself. I was walking the dog with my husband one morning, and I tend to be one of those people that jumps in and tells him how he should be doing things all the time. And he was talking about advice he had given a younger person that he mentors. And I could feel welling up in me this judgment about why that was the wrong advice to give him. And I was all set to say, you should have. And I heard myself say, pause, take a deep breath. And when I got curious, I'm like, whose story is this? This is already past. You can't give him any advice about what to do. It's already done. What question can you ask? And that literally took me like probably 12 seconds, because it doesn't take very long. And then out of my mouth was, and so what happened? What was the outcome? And as he went on to tell me the rest of the story, it turned out I totally agreed with the advice that he had given him and where it had led. And so for me, it was that opportunity to see and realize that by not asking questions, by eclipsing conversations, I wasn't giving our relationship the full depth that could develop if I just paused a moment and asked a question.
That's a really great example.
And those of you that have children, grandchildren, dealing with teenagers, I find this is like the greatest return on investment when you take this practice with your children, and you feel yourself falling below the line, maybe something they've done or something that's frustrating, or you see them frustrating, and learning to have a conversation worth having with them. And just it creates resilient kids. People say my kids are positive. No, they're resilient. Bad things are going to happen. They're not going to make all great decisions, but it's the resiliency that you will see in them over time.
Well, I know that you've involved your kids along your journey, Jackie, because of the story about your daughter that's included in the book.
Yeah, I won't, I guess I am going to give away just part of the ending of that. But when my husband was diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer, all I could think about stage 4, he's going to die. And then as we began to ask questions with the oncologist, certain stage 4 cancers are not terminal. She gave me a 50-50 chance. I kept wanting her to give me like an 80-20, and she wouldn't do that. And I remember driving home, how I was going to frame this conversation with my 10 and 12-year-old at the time. And then my daughter, Allie, threw me off keel when she said, is Dad going to die? We haven't seen him. And I wanted to say, well, what came out is I said, we're all going to die. But she wanted me to say, he's going to be okay, honey. And then after I said, we're all going to die, she looked at me kind of funny, and I said, let's talk about how we're going to have to change this household when your dad comes home. And we started having a conversation around that, because I couldn't promise her he was going to make it. And I will say the ending of this story, it's he's been in remission for almost 10 years now, after we went through that ordeal.
Yeah, I love the happy ending to that story. And also all the AI abbreviation, all the AI abbreviations in the chat.
Yes.
That's fun too. I don't know that I've ever had webinar guests before that were so able to toggle between the chat and the conversation. So well done, ladies. I love seeing your engagement in the chat as well. So at this point, we are going to start to take some of the questions that you have been putting in the chat. It's been moving very fast. So if you put a question in earlier that we haven't had a chance to get to yet, I would invite you to find your own question and put it back in the bottom of the chat for me. Or, I'm going to take a second and scroll through. But I'm curious, I did see someone make a a comment earlier about listening and the importance of listening for a great conversation. And I'm wondering how that folds in, or in what way you might coach people in this world of generative questions and positive framing to ensure that they are listening well.
So we actually have a whole section in our training on listening. And we offer two suggestions. One is to really listen from what we call a dialogical perspective, which is listening to understand without downloading what you're going to say next, without listening to defend. We make a distinction between debate, discussion, and dialogue, and that an appreciative inquiry, or in conversations worth having, listening is like dialogical listening. You're really listening for, do I understand this? And should I ask a question to clarify? You want to make sure that you fully appreciate and understand where the other person is coming from. It's that place of openness, again, and real genuine curiosity. And we give two like simple things that you can do to make sure you're listening. As one is to do that quick scan. It's a quick tuning in of where am I? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What do I want to have happen? What do I want to say? And just to get yourself centered there, and then do a very quick biological scan of taking a deep breath and elongating your spine and letting that go, and then centering the body just by like moving back and forth and side to side and front to back, just finding your center. Lowering your center of gravity, relaxing the jaw, and then asking yourself, what if I could get a little more? And then whatever quality comes up for you, allow yourself to get that little more quality of being centered and present. And when you're there, you're in a much better place to listen. And again, you can do those two things in 30 seconds.
Thank you. So I have a question here from Jane, and they are asking, what about when the people you want to communicate with have a background or predisposition for the opposite of growth mindset and curiosity?
So if you're thinking about somebody who has a fixed mindset, is that that's what I'm hearing here?
Yes.
Yes. What I think is really interesting, again, the technique of just pausing, breathing, and get curious. You want to get curious about that person's fixed mindset. And I think your tone and direction for how you're talking to the person with the fixed mindset, if you're asking generative questions, whether they know it or like it or not, you're actually getting to the frontal part, this part of their brain, and they're actually, whether they're doing it, they're actually pausing, breathing, and getting curious, and they're starting to engage in that conversation. So when we went to the second edition, we learned so much more about tuning in and the sciences behind it, that just by asking generative questions, you begin to create a frame that is positive in the person that may have come into the conversation with a fixed mindset.
I think also, if I could add to that, often people equate generative questions or appreciative questions with being positive. And we would want to underscore that a generative question is not always a positive question. You might ask questions that uncover more of what a problem or an issue is, because that's of value. A generative question is one that adds value, that helps you connect with the other person. If you have an agenda, if you're asking questions because you want this person to change their thinking or their belief system, you're not in a place of genuine curiosity and openness. So I would first check yourself. And if you're really curious and want to understand, and you're coming from a place of, I don't want to change them, I just want to understand. And that can be hard if you're talking with somebody who's rigid and feels like they're already on the defensive. So yeah, check in with yourself first about why am I in this conversation? What's my purpose? And I think if you are genuinely curious and interested, and asking generative questions, then exactly what Jackie just said is going to happen, because they will feel seen and heard.
Thank you, Cheri. Alfred's asking us to speak to being prepared for what the questions might unleash.
That's a great question, Alfred. I know that when I have used, and somebody asked about, can you do this with teams and groups? When you ask generative questions, and you remember, appreciate, I'm valuing you in the situation, I've never seen anything negative unleashed. I see the other person coming up with, I'm understanding them, they're understanding me, and it's almost like we begin to move forward to a conversation worth having.
And I would also caution you about asking questions that border on therapeutic questions if you're not skilled and trained in that and the person hasn't given you permission to go there. Because that's, I'm not sure what when you say what the questions might unleash, if you're really curious and you're not asking therapeutic questions, they're going to unleash knowledge and information and possibility, and at the very least broaden your appreciation and understanding of the other person and where they're coming from.
Looks like Alfred is clarifying and saying that they're speaking more to the floodgate of emotions that could come out.
Right. Yeah.
Marcia's asking if you can clarify what you mean by a therapeutic question.
It's that the question that borders on inviting someone to disclose, you know, in an inappropriate context, childhood trauma or something that would that might explain the problem or the situation that they're in right now. I think that's what I mean by more therapeutic environment. And I think people asking to hear someone's story can often unleash an emotional response, because people do feel suddenly seen and heard. And I would just, unless you're a therapist, I would avoid kind of pursuing and going down the road of trying to change or get into the nitty-gritty of a person's story, as opposed to just hearing them.
Thank you, Cheri. So I have a really big question here from Chip. And they are asking, related to a former question, I'm not sure which one, how we have meaningful conversations at any level, especially those most worthwhile, when today there's increasing hostility. Effective polarization in the US is highest among the 12 OECD countries studied by Stanford. And when there's so much increasing basic disagreement on facts, I'm going to breeze over some of this, but I think you can probably see it too. And then he says, I'd say values-based engagement is a huge part of the solution, looking for shared identities possible. And do you address this in the book? And do you have any thoughts on this? So that's a really big question.
Go ahead, Jackie.
You know, I'm actually reading, it is a very long question, Chip. I don't know if I have a response to what you're asking, but you do want to create a shared understanding and not be in there solving problems or asking yes or no questions, but more open questions to understand what it is that they want you to understand, and to making sure that once that is surfaced, that you share what you understand and how you see it.
Yeah, and I also think that when someone is committed to an ideology or a frame, period, and they will explain their frame over and over again, but they are not interested in expanding, questioning, engaging beyond that. There are some people that you're not going to move move that conversation forward. And so we don't actually go deeply into that, those kinds of conversations in the book. And they are most challenging.
Yeah, and a great comment here from Matthew saying that appreciative inquiry-based conversation is what's lacking in those situations, and people who are wanting to fight about issues are not having appreciative conversations.
Right.
And that's why
those are not worth having,
right.
potentially.
That's why zooming in is so important in the second edition is how do we get these people who are having these polarized conversations? It's almost like a timeout, pause, breathe, and get curious and learn about these practices so that it's okay to have opposing views, but it's how we engage in that conversation and how we move forward.
Right. And it might also be addressing our common humanity and get off the topic that is polarizing and shift to connecting as human beings around something that is of value.
That's super helpful. Great question here from Carolyn. As we embark on entering conversations generatively, what can we listen for and watch for in a conversation that signals we are on the right track or not on the right track in having a good conversation?
Great question.
Mm-hmm.
I would track what's going on in your own body mindset and what's going on in the other person. If you are getting a sense of deeper and deeper connection to the other, if you are more in a space of we instead of me, if you find yourself more curious about the other person and they're curious about you, and there feels like there's either this this expansiveness to the conversation or a movement forward, it usually feels exciting and energizing in the body. Those are usually telltale signs that you're in a conversation worth having. And when you start to withdraw or pull in or feel defensive or start thinking about me, you're losing that connection.
And I actually go back to the body mindset. You can feel when you've walked away, you can feel in your body when you're in a negative, destructive, critical conversation. Your back hurts, it hurts here. And sometimes I want to run out of the room. And then when you're in a great conversation because you lose track of time, you're in flow. And so you can really feel when you're heading down or heading up.
Those body signs are really critical. So could you speak to the practice of clarifying what type of conversation someone might want to have and what they need in that moment? I think this question is referencing, maybe some signaling that you can give to another person that you want to have a generative conversation. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure. It sounds like it's an option or a possibility for framing the conversation you'd like to be in.
Yes.
And so I think, again, it's that starting by pausing, taking that deep breath and get curious. What is the conversation I want to be in? What's the conversation both of us will want to be in? What are we trying to achieve together? And then framing that conversation. I really want to connect with you. And what do you think about being in this conversation? A conversation about, would that be of interest to you? Because that would really excite me. And if not, is there another one?
And I think vulnerability is key to realize, even if you're not the person that started the critical or destructive conversation, somebody has to ask for that do-over. Say, that was not a very good, and here's why, and just saying, could we do this over again? Can we, and again, that can go into the framing and just ask for that do-over conversation.
I love that. I could often use a do-over. So I referenced earlier on in the hour that this is more than just a book. Can we talk now about ways that people can get involved with the content of conversations worth having beyond the book?
Sure. I just want to, before I answer that, people want to save the chat. They like it so much, Becky. So I don't know if they can save the chat.
Yeah. So the public chat, I think, can be saved. There is if you look in the chat, there are 3 dots to the right of where you see to everyone, and you should have the option on your own computer to save the chat. And so try it out and let me know. As a rule, we don't distribute the chat after an event because there is a mix of that public and private conversation.
Oh,
But
right. You can save the chat.
Yeah, it's
yes,
a really rich conversation.
So getting back to your question, I just was catching that in the chat.
Sure, no problem. I did not see it.
If you go to our website in the short version of cwh.today, there's a couple of things. You can download a free toolkit, and it gives kind of a nice video clip, very, very short, less than 2 minutes, about the essence of the book. There are a list of generative questions to ask in workplace situations with colleagues, and there's a questionnaire for with children, whether you're talking to teachers or parents talking to your children, and there's an executive summary of the book. Our website also has a blog that has issues that you can look at, and you can see how we did the flip, framed them, and the types of questions. And on this Monday, November 15th, we're having a Monday, we call it Monday Kickstarters, and we do Monday Kickstarters 4 or 5 times a year. And people from all over the world, just like today, show up, and we practice what we've been talking about here. And people will type their problem or situation in the chat, and we'll start from a place of generative questions, and we will actually do 2 or 3 issues within 30 minutes. So this Monday, it's 12:30 to 1 p.m. And we do.
Is that Eastern time, Jackie?
I'm sorry, Eastern time zone as well.
Well, and I know that there are even more resources than the Monday Kickstarter. Can you talk about the focus books?
Sure. We have started publishing focus books, and those are taking the Conversations Worth Having practices and applying them very specifically to a field or a sector. We published our first one this summer. It's called Conversations Worth Having for Clinicians, Caseworkers, and Coaches. That's available on Amazon. And then we have one we're working on with a physician and a trainer in the healthcare field. That one's on Conversations Worth Having in Healthcare. We've got one coming up on Conversations Worth Having with yourself. And then a number of our trainers have put in their kind of, I'd like to write one on this, and I'd like to write one on this. So we'll probably publish it at least 2 to 4 every year in combination with our certified trainers in their field of expertise.
Can you talk about that opportunity to be a certified trainer?
Sure. Those people who have taken our boot camps, there's a conversation boot camp and a strategic conversations boot camp. Once you've taken both those boot camps, if you're interested in offering the Conversations Worth Having boot camps or using all the materials, you can sign up for our certification program. And as soon as you sign up for the next certification program, you have access to all of our materials, our slides, our guidebooks, our videos, our articles, training materials, marketing materials. We are really passionate about trying to get these practices out in the world, and Jackie and I will never be able to do that alone. We want to partner with people around the world to make this possible. And so our goal is to build well-being and possibility around the world as rapidly as we can.
Well, and how far you've come since the first book came out.
Yeah.
You know, from the first edition in 2018 to today with the varied programs and offerings that you have. It's really incredible to see the progress that you're making in spreading this message.
Thank you.
So before we wrap today's call, we do have we've been putting some links in the chat, but there are a few ways that you can continue to stay engaged with this content. And I saw a question earlier from, I believe it was someone overseas who was wondering about how to find and buy the book. And so Wendy, if we can look at that call to action slide, there's a few things that you can do as a result of today's call. We would encourage you to buy the new edition of Conversations Worth Having, even if you already have the first edition, because as we noted on today's call, there is a brand new chapter and a lot of other additional resources included in the second edition of the book. If you have already read conversations worth having, we would love to see your Amazon review on the new edition of the book. So we would encourage you to review the book. Even a few sentences of an honest review can really help as it relates to reaching more readers with this book. Again, you can also download the toolkit, and you can visit Conversations Worth Having today to be able to access even more resources that Jackie and Cheri are so generously providing to their communities. So before we say goodbye, and love seeing all of this warm and encouraging content in the chat, I want to kick it back to you, Jackie and Cheri, for some parting inspiration for those who really want to live out the content that we've been speaking about today.
You know, my thought is that your conversations make all the difference in your life and other people's life. So stay in the driver's seat. You can literally begin to change the world that surrounds you, just one conversation at a time.
Couldn't say it better.
Thanks, everyone.